what went through the minds of detectives as they searched for clues in one of Austin's most infamous cold cases? We sit down with two investigators who were at the center of the search for the killer in the yogurt shop murders. And we learn what other cases could be connected. The latest on this episode of Unsolved. For nearly 30 years, families, friends, really an entire community here in Austin wondered who was responsible for killing 4 young girls shot in a North Austin yogurt shop in 1991. That is, until last September. Investigators revealed a major breakthrough. A suspected serial killer, Robert Brashears, responsible for the deaths of Eliza Thomas, Amy Ayers, and Jennifer and Sarah Harbison. Joining me here today is Mindy Montfort, longtime Texas prosecutor and until very recently the head of the Texas Attorney General's Cold Case Unit, and then Detective Dan Jackson, who led the team at Austin Police through all of the latest breakthroughs in this case. So thank you so much to both of you for being here.
Sure.
It's good to be here.
Thanks.
Yeah, I want to start with what is new, because the last time we talked to the two of you or heard from you was at that press conference in September, where you of course revealed so much in this major breakthrough. We now know the person behind this gruesome crime, but walk us through what's happened since. Are there any new developments about the suspect in this case that you can share?
Well, one of the things we're trying to do is get the word out still. If they didn't see that press conference, then they're not going to know about Robert Brashears. So we're trying to do a bulletin that will go out nationally to cold case units and police departments and prosecutors' offices, so that they might look at their cases if there are similarities, depending on the years that they may have unsolved cases of their own, and depending on where Brashears was. We've got a map and a timeline, and we're wrapping that up. But that's taken quite a bit of time to put together.
We know that you all revealed he moved around a lot or traveled a bit, and so are there any regions or places in particular that you're trying to zero in on, or is it really truly a national bulletin like you said?
For our part, I mean, it is going to be a national bulletin. We're definitely focusing on Texas as well, because we know when he was in Texas, or at least the time periods we know he was in Texas. We want to make sure those whereabouts, that those police departments in Texas are contacted to review their cases. But we are going to send it out to departments all over the country.
Do we have any idea about an estimate of how many cases he could be connected to?
I don't think there's any way to know. Like I said at the press conference during the questioning, somebody asked me that, or something similar to that question, and I said, 2 months ago we knew of 3 murders, today we know of 8. So I have to qualify everything I say about Robert Brashears, and I always say Brashears even though it's Brashears, is that when I make a statement about his crimes, I have to always qualify it with that we know of. So it's like, he never killed a man that we know of, right? So there really is, it's wide open.
I think that just shows how this situation is still developing. I mean, even as we speak, this has come up a lot as we've covered this case and in conversations about it. Would you consider the case that became known as the yogurt shop murders solved?
It's solved. We know he is the suspect and the lone suspect, but there's still lingering questions that we're trying to answer every day. And we may never know the answers to them. Things like, why was he in Austin? Did he have some connection? Was it completely random? Who was he here visiting with, if anybody? And why the yogurt shop? Why those 4 girls? There's just a lot of whys, and so we're still working to clear that up. But being 34 years ago, we may not ever be 100% sure. So far, the leads we've run down of potential connections have all been dead ends.
I want to back up a little bit so people can get to know the two of you. Mindy, you grew up in Austin, and Dan in Central Texas. And so talk about what your awareness of this case was before becoming investigators. Do you remember the moment you heard about this case?
I do very well. Actually, I grew up not too far from the yogurt shop, and 2 of the girls had been at North Cross Mall that same night. I can't tell you the number of times I'd been to North Cross Mall. It was right in our neighborhood. Austin, as a lot of people know, that was a very different place back then. You could walk to the store by yourself. You know, we didn't hear really about murders that often. And when this happened, I actually remember I was in college, seeing it on the news and thinking, oh my gosh, that's, you know, Northwest Hills. That's where I grew up. And seeing that footage and hearing what had happened on that night was just horrendous. And you almost just disbelief that could happen in Austin, Texas. And I'm not sure if you remember, but right after that, we had Colleen Reed, who got abducted by, now we know, Kenneth McDuff, but not too far away. I mean, right there on 6th Street, so West 6th. It just seemed like our community was changing dramatically.
Yeah. What about you, Detective?
So I don't remember the exact moment. I was quite a bit younger than Mindy.
Oh, thank you for highlighting that, Dan.
Wasn't quite in college yet, but I was Amy's age. And I grew up in San Marcos, which is the Austin market. So I remember this happening, seeing it on the news and, you know, in the newspapers, and every evening there was something. But I remember growing up with it because we would go to North Cross Mall, you know, back then, and it probably, I think, still is. It's the only place in Central Texas to go ice skating. So if you're going to go ice skating, that's where you would go. So I do remember it. I remember the billboards around town, you know, who killed these girls. And so I sort of grew up with the case, and I remember the trials. I was already, I moved away at that point, but I was just a couple hours away. But yeah, I remember growing up with this case. Never thought I'd be working on it, but this was part of who we are as Central Texas.
Being the same age as one of the victims too at the time must be pretty scary as a kid.
Yeah, I don't think I was 12, but I don't know if it really sank in, you know, that this happened to I don't know. It was so long ago.
Yeah,
I was pretty young.
Talk to me a bit now as law enforcement officers. I'm sure there are dozens of cases that stick with you in one way or another, but talk about what it was about this case that made it resonate with essentially an entire generation of people from Austin, but also across the country. There were so many eyeballs on this over the years.
The fact that it was 4 young girls doing something so innocent in a neighborhood setting, you know, I mean, what could be more innocent than working at an ice cream or yogurt shop? And, you know, that 2 of them were just waiting to get their ride home, and they were waiting on, you know, the older sister to take them. And the fact that all 4, and 2 were sisters, you know, brutally murdered, and in such a horrible, devastating way with the fire to just destroy all the evidence. And what kind of monster does that? And that just, it just didn't happen. We didn't see things like that in Austin, Texas. And I just remember that stuck with me. And also later, being in the DA's office when they were going to try those cases, and just fascinated, and also just the families, you know, I never even met them, but I connected with them as just hometown families. You know, this could have been anybody else from our neighborhood. You know, if it was them, if it could happen in Northwest Hills, then it could really happen anywhere or to anybody.
I know we've danced around some of the details of the case. I think sometimes we assume, you know, if you've lived in Austin for any amount of time, you've gotten some exposure, you've seen a headline. But walk us through some of the details of this case. What stood out to you as investigators, if you could give us some of what happened on that day in 1991?
Well, I think the brutality stands out. Like, this is the worst case I've ever investigated. And I've been involved in quite a bit of violent crime investigations over my career. And so I think just there's things you can't unsee. Those crime scene photos, I'll never forget that. And that's coming from someone who's worked literally thousands of deaths in my career. So I think the brutality of it, and not knowing who, why, what, just really drives us.
We've talked about this before on this show, but what is that like, holding that as an investigator? You have a job to do, and you have to-do lists and things to push this case forward. You have a goal, but that's got to be so difficult to sit with some of the things you've seen in this case in particular.
I think so. And one of the frustrating things is that you see the public thought this was a cold case. Like, why isn't anybody working this? Why can't you get up and solve this case? And what they didn't know is that Mindy and I worked on this case just about every day of our lives for the last 3 years. And so, but you don't want to broadcast that. It's not like we're on TikTok telling everybody, hey, this morning, this is what I did. So that was, the public just assumed that, thought that we had forgotten about it. And that was the farthest from the truth.
It's a lot of pressure, to be hearing that criticism and then knowing how hard you're working on it. One of the things I want to stick in 1991 for a moment, the scene, something that has come up over and over again is the evidence at that scene. Obviously, Mindy, you mentioned the shop was set on fire, so that's another complication. The brutality you mentioned. What can you walk us through about the evidence in this case that ultimately became really key? Was there a piece of it that just jumped out the most as you began to investigate?
Yeah, so that was the tenacity of those original investigators is what led us to solve this case years later. So they knew all the girls had been shot, and they had seen that Amy had been shot twice. And so at the autopsy, it was realized that Amy had been shot with 2 different caliber weapons. The 22s that all the girls had been shot with, and a slightly larger caliber, looks like to be a 380. And so the detectives who were at the autopsy notified the detectives who were still processing the crime scene all night long and said, hey, look, go back. There could be a spent shell casing there because we have a second caliber. And so they started combing through all the debris, and they ended up finding it in the drain. Like, they opened the drain and went down and dug it out. And that was really one of the very few pieces of evidence that they actually got besides some DNA because of the destruction of the fire. But that ultimately led to the solving of this case, or at least the domino effect that led to the solving of this case.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, if you remember, at the trials, they didn't have any physical evidence, so it was really based on the statements alone. And as a prosecutor, that's a very hard case to prove. But years later, they were able to get this unknown Y profile from the crime scene. So you can just see how over time you're able to get more and more and more. And I always thought, because there was DNA, and in so many of these cases that we look at, there isn't any, or the evidence is lost. So I knew, because we had DNA, we didn't know we had DNA until later, but once we knew we had DNA, and with technology improving, I just knew one day this was going to get solved, or we would figure out whose Y profile that was. I just didn't know if we'd still be around.
That actually brings me right to my next couple of questions. I want to walk through people in order of when you two came on the case and then what developments followed. So talk to me just a bit, Mindy, about how you became a part of this. When did you start looking at this case?
When I became the first assistant district attorney under then District Attorney Margaret Moore, one of our very first meetings, so this would have been in 2017, one of our very first meetings was with the Ayers families. And it was so emotional walking into that meeting because I had studied this case. I felt like I lived it. I read every article about it. I was just always fascinated with it, and even watched some of the trial originally. So to follow it all these years and feel that just devastation for those families and what the anguish they had to go through in the roller coaster ride over the many years, it was a career highlight just walking in that room and meeting them for the first time, and then actually engaging in conversation and hearing what they wanted from us. And really what they wanted was just, don't forget the case, and please pick it back up and follow the evidence, and money, please tell me money's not going to be an object. That was what each family member expressed to us. And Margaret Moore said, funding is not an issue. We will make sure this case gets investigated fully. And then she assigned me to be on that case full time, in addition to your other duties. But it was an honor, truly. And we began working with APD weekly at that time. I think we would meet every Friday to go through. We developed a war room, basically, at the DA's office, and I couldn't wait to get up there on Fridays. That was almost the best way to end your week, knowing you could go spend a couple hours or 3 hours on the case. And so that was kind of the way my involvement started. And then I cannot, you asked earlier about how do you turn it off, or how does it affect you. I have to say, from that first meeting the Ayers and telling them, we are going to stay with this case. We may not be able to get you answers, but we're going to try like hell to do it. And we're not going to give up, at least while we're on it. And knowing that we made that promise to them, I took that to heart, and there probably wasn't a day since 2017 that I haven't thought, at least for 30 seconds in one day, maybe about Yogurt Shop. You know, it's always in the back of your mind. What are we missing? What can we do next? Maybe we should go back and look at page 19. Maybe we should, I mean, so many times Dan and I would be waiting around for evidence to get back. You know, it takes forever. And we would say, okay, well, let's start from page 1 basically and start going through all of this again. Just, you know, you're going to make yourself crazy if you're not working on it at some point, you know.
Yeah. So talk to us then. I know that was, 4 years in the DA's office of work. And we had a long conversation with the DA, Margaret Moore, right when this breakthrough happened last September. I encourage people to go listen to that conversation about some of the developments that you all, the strides you made with that unit within your office. But then you're leaving office and you've made this promise to the families. Tell folks what happened next.
That was one of those things where how do you let go of something you've worked on for so long? I mean, it just that you think about every day. And we were making strides. You know, we, like Dan says, I mean, the investigators were always working this case. It's just that a lot of things would take time. You know, we'd have to wait for more lab results to get back, or go interview this witness. What did the witness say? You know, and we've had so many ups and downs, and we would joke occasionally, you know, oh, it's Yogurt Shop, right? So, I mean, anything can happen because you get so excited about a lead and then boom, 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 you know, womp, womp, it didn't pan out. Yeah. I can't tell you the number of times that happened. There's so many in my mind, going through my mind about the number of times that happened. But, you know, over Margaret's administration, so once she left office and Jose Garza was bringing in a new first assistant, that's a lot of times that's what people do. We had already talked to the Texas AG's office at that time about the creation of a statewide cold case unit. Actually, members of the APD cold case unit at the time, the heirs, we all went and presented a PowerPoint to the AG staff and said, this is why we think a statewide unit would be so helpful to Texas. We have over 20,000 unsolved homicides in the state of Texas alone. It's an epidemic. And if we can find some way in a statewide setting to connect resources to local departments, the AG's office made the most sense. And they seemed to really like the idea at the time, but as always, it's about funding. And so we knew we were probably going to have to wait for a legislative session to try to get this rolling. But as luck would have it, right when we were leaving office, received a call from the AG's office, and they said, you know, we'd still like to do this. Are you interested? And it was just perfect timing. And so I went over there and started it as just one person. And now it is, there's 8 full-time employees and, you know, 4 investigators and a criminal intelligence analyst. So it's really been a great unit, and it allowed me, most importantly, to continue working on the Yogurt Shop.
You mentioned the 20,000 or more cold cases, but to have this case that was so central be really the driving force behind that unit, I think is fascinating to so many people. I know we could do a whole episode with you, and we will, Mindy, about the cold case unit within the OAG's office, but briefly want to ask you, in addition to this major breakthrough with the Yogurt Shop case, what other successes, are there other big successes that you feel like stand out? You know, just highlight for folks how essential the creation of that unit was to not just this case.
I really do have to give credit to the AG's office for, you know, having the vision to allow us to start that unit, especially with no funding. So, and they, you know, over the years, it really has become, I think, a very successful unit. Obviously, this was a great success. I mean, this was really APD's case, but we were along for the ride the whole way, and it was truly an honor to be working with them on this. We've had a couple of others. You know, when we started this unit, I actually reached out to the Ohio Attorney General's office, because that was one of the only AG's offices I had seen in my research that had a cold case unit. And they spent hours with me and walked me through how they do things in their unit. It's run very well. They've had a lot of success. And they told me, you know, I actually asked them, how many cases should we expect to solve a year? You know, I'm going in there ready to go, right? We're going to solve 100 cases a year. And they said actually success would be about 1, because these are so complicated and the evidence is usually missing, or the you have a lot of deterioration over time. It's degraded. It's small amounts, and even with great technology, it's very difficult to get a profile. And so they said it usually takes about 1 a year, and I can say that we've pretty much met that goal. The first year we had to get up and running, and that was in 2022. And since that time, I said 2021. And since that time, we've had about a case a year success. Baby Holly was probably the more famous one, because that hit national news.
Right.
Holly Miller. But, Dan can probably say this too. You work on so many of these cases, and yes, success is a solve, but really to these families, I get told time and time again that their success is the fact that someone hasn't forgotten the case, that they're not letting it sit on a shelf. Somebody is looking at the case, and that's success to them. So in those terms, I feel like we've had a lot of success stories.
I want to get back into some of the evidence you mentioned and bring you back in, Detective, but one of the last things I do want to ask before we move on is you are leaving the Attorney General's office, and you are actually launching something new. I think our audience would really love to hear. It sounds like through the course of your career, your goal has been to connect law enforcement investigators across the country. Tell us about what's next for you.
Well, it's very new. We're definitely in the middle of designing it, but the Ayers family is very supportive, and they've been talking to me about this for a long time, about a nonprofit. We deal with so many smaller, actually small and large agencies. I mean, Dan can attest to that APD even suffers from a lack of funding for DNA testing, for training. And so, we don't feel like any of these cases should not be looked at because of a lack of funding. And so if we need to go out and raise dollars to do it, then that's what we're going to do. And connecting, you're absolutely right. I think networking and connecting resources is so important. And with the Brasher's case, I mean, with Yogurt Shop, we learned that hands over fist, because if we had connected with some of these agencies years ago when they had identified him, maybe we would have, maybe not, but maybe we would have used that as a lead in our own case and we would have looked at him. So I do think that there needs to be more resources out there connecting agencies to each other and then to additional resources.
And really special that this effort is so closely tied to the families in this case.
Right. That's their vision. It really is. They want to help other families. And that's always been, even when we went and presented this to the Attorney General's office, they said at that time, if it can't help us, that's not why we're here. It may never help us, but if we can help other families, then that's worth it. Even one family. That's always been their saying.
We're so glad to sit here and say that in this case, it did help understand who was at the heart of this crime. And so I do want to walk through some of that. You mentioned working with some of the other departments. We're going to take our viewers on a journey from South Carolina and Kentucky and all over. But Detective Jackson, I want to start with you because you were assigned to this case in 2022.
Yep.
And you've said before, you just started asking a lot of questions. Where do you start when you get assigned a case like this?
Well, I didn't realize the vastness of this case when I got it. I mean, I knew it was a big case, right? But I kind of knew the Wikipedia version of it from growing up around here. And I got assigned the case on the first day. I was in the regular homicide unit, and I switched over to the cold case unit. And my first day there, I was asked to take over the case.
Big first day.
Yeah. And so, big first day. I thought I was in trouble because they, come in my office and shut the door. And so I was like, how am I already in trouble? Day one. That's usually when your sergeant tells you to shut the door, you've done something wrong. But when he asked me if I would take it over, I said yes, of course. And I knew right then it was going to be with me the rest of my life. Like, I just knew it. Like, this is it. Even though and I have a whole other caseload. Like, this is not my only case. Really, we just had to start. I talked to some other detectives and kind of got spun up on kind of where the investigation had been over the years. And then just sort of started going through documents and reading and trying to put together a timeline in my head of what had been done, what hadn't been done, what could be done. And so that's how I spent the first few months is just sort of trying to wrap my head around everything. What do we have? What do we need? And where's DNA technology at now that could maybe do something different than had been tried before? And then it took about several months, and then I finally reached out to the Ayers family, since they were sort of the spokespeople for the victims, and introduced myself. I didn't want to call them like the first day to be like, hey, I'm a new guy, because I don't have anything to offer as far as what I was doing on the case or what I was planning on doing. So it took a few months before I introduced myself, and they were very nice, a little guarded at first because I was, again, new guy. And they'd heard this spiel before, right, over the years, ups and downs, and so I explained kind of how my approach was going to be, and I was going to do things a little bit different because I knew some of their concerns were that they didn't feel like they were included in the information about the case. And how do I know it's being worked if every time they're just told, like, well, for the integrity of the case, like, I can't tell you. So I made a point to, like, keep them abreast of everything I did and let them know where I was going, way more than I would in a normal case, because I felt like after 30-something years, they deserve to know. But I did tell them that if I ever say I can't talk about it, that don't bother me for a while. That's a good thing, because that means there's been development. And so they said, I hope you tell me that someday, to back off for a little bit. But I remember, talking to Angie that first night, and she said, she was kind of wrapping the conversation up. She goes, I appreciate the call, but, no offense, but you're just number 246 to us so far. And I said, what? She said, you're the 246th name on this case of detectives. And, which I don't blame her for saying that. Like, and so I don't know, what do you say to that, right? Like, so I told her I'm going to do my best to make sure there's not a 247. And so after I solved it, like, I reminded her of that, hey, remember? Like, we were hugging and crying. And I was like, ain't no 247.
Oh my gosh, I have chills hearing that. That's pretty incredible.
And after that, Mindy had the idea. I'd met Mindy, we kind of got over the case a little bit. And she had the idea that they were hosting a cold case conference at the AG's office that fall or winter. And so she had the idea of, well, we've got these experts from around the country coming in town, like, they're all gonna be one place. Let's see if they're willing to, like, stick around a half day and go over the case, and maybe they have some ideas of what we could do. And so that sort of got the ball rolling with these subject matter experts that had been experts in DNA and cold case prosecution. We sat down in a big conference room, we had spreadsheets and PowerPoints, and went through, like, sort of everything we have, what could be retested, what hasn't maybe been tested, sort of tiered structure of best to worst items. And we kept in contact either in person or Zoom or text or email over the next 3 years.
Monthly, at least.
Monthly, yes, or anytime there was something we needed to talk about. And we've all become friends. So sometimes it's just personal business, like, hey, how's your kid doing at baseball? Something like that. But that's sort of how the case got started with me, at least.
And a lot of those subject matter experts were from the Golden State Killer case. So we had connected with them back in, I don't know, 2018, 2019, and they had come to the DA's office and done a roundtable with us, letting us know about technology that they used. It was really, genealogy was very, very new. It wasn't new in the industry, but new to a lot of us. And we wanted to know how they had solved the Golden State Killer case with genealogy and if it could work in this case. And so they went through all of our evidence at that time and were kind of giving us some ideas on some of the things we should consider testing again. And so Dan's right, when we had a conference years later, and a lot of those same people were coming to present at that conference about Golden State Killer, we said, let's do it again. Things may have changed and we may not be aware of certain things that are out there now. And so those meetings were very productive to the case. We owe them a lot.
And I'll note a key person in that investigation now partnering with you on your efforts.
That's right, Anne-Marie Schubert, who was the prosecutor. She was the elected DA in Sacramento at the time of the Golden State Killer. And again, when we had that meeting at the DA's office, that was sort of what ignited this idea that, wait a minute, if we're so progressive in Austin, Texas, and we don't know about a lot of these resources, out in the country, the rest of the country, how do we know that Lubbock or Corpus Christi or Abilene knows about these? And so that was another reason that having a statewide unit became such an important and we thought a good idea, because that's a way to disseminate information that we were learning from the Golden State Killer team and hopefully passing that along to other departments.
So I want to get back to our timeline here. So you have this list of where to begin again, I guess I should say. What was the first stop for you, the most important thing, or the piece of evidence you just couldn't let go of?
Probably the swabs from the sexual assault kits, that we knew what we had, and we had very little DNA and a pretty much terrible mixtures of just the nature of how those kits are collected. You're going to get overwhelmingly victims' DNA and usually very little suspect. And so we knew that ratio was not really good enough yet to do anything with, but talking to some of these private labs around the country, they're like, hey, we're not there yet, but we're getting there. And so the threshold for quality and quantity getting smaller and smaller. So we knew where we were, we knew where we needed to be, and that gap was ever shrinking with some of these samples. But also some of these samples were going to be a last-ditch effort. Like they've been consumed over the years with different testing methods, and so there's very little left in a lot of it. And then there was a few other items that weren't going to be very testable years ago that now we had different technologies that could possibly, extract DNA from. So we just started working with that and working with different labs. And one lab may be better at one thing versus another. We sent, Signature Science did a ton of stuff for us, DNA Labs International, Estrella out in California, because each lab kind of has different niches. And so we reached out to everybody that would listen to us. And everybody was great, willing to help, Talk to one lab and they say, well, yeah, we can do it, but so-and-so's better than us, that's their deal. So let me put you in contact with whoever. Everybody was on board with working and helping to resolve this case.
Especially when the DNA itself, as you mentioned, is so precious. You can, in theory, run out of it, which I know very nearly happened in this case. Talk about that feeling. What is that like when you're sending something off for a test and you're waiting? And I know that happened not just with DNA, but also ballistics at times in this case, different pieces of evidence. But, what is that moment like? And what do you do in the waiting? What do you two talk about when you're waiting for something to come back?
Well, we bugged the lab.
We kept calling them.
Texting them. A lot of times the stuff gets sent out and it's like, all right, well, we've got a few months. What else can we look at while we're waiting? And with this case, we would get tips trickling in, still continuously through email or Crime Stoppers or whatever website. And so we had leads to chase down. We looked at some very, very bad people that were living in Austin. It's crazy how many monsters were in Austin back in '91. Because we look at guys like that guy looks pretty good. Let's go get his DNA. And then, because he was in prison for murdering people or raping children or whatever it was, and we can put him right there. And then we could go out and talk to him or get a swab and strike out again.
Explain for people, I know you mentioned earlier this YSTR. There's so many technical terms, and I think people have watched enough, cold case shows, but explain in layman's terms, what was that? What are you trying to match at that point?
That was the most difficult thing, because by the time I came on the case, we knew that we had DNA. So when they tried the cases originally, they didn't have DNA. Years later, because technology had changed, they decided to resubmit items or submit items for testing to see if they could get a profile. And they did, and they were able to get what's called a YSTR profile. And that is associated with male DNA. So in a family, the male relatives will share the YSTR profile. You can't necessarily go forward only with a Y, because that Y could be ancestors. It doesn't necessarily, traditional DNA deals with STR profiles. So when we hear about the CODIS database and you match kind of a 1-to-1, you're matching with somebody's complete profile. But in a YSTR, it's the male side. So it was an uphill battle because you can't just upload the YSTR profile we have into CODIS. There's not a national database for that. And so it was really trying to find that needle in a haystack. And when Dan talks about testing one person after another, what do you think? There's over 300?
400 or 500 we've tested direct.
Wow.
Over the years.
Trying to compare and figure out if it's that.
Eliminations, like family, friends, first responders from the night of, all that kind of stuff, plus hundreds of suspects that you have to do a 1-to-1 comparison to.
And as a prosecutor, that was what was frustrating, knowing we could not go forward with prosecuting this case until we identified that Y profile, because jurors were going to have too many questions, and they should. That creates reasonable doubt. And even if that Y profile turned out to be a customer or an employee or a family member and not anything to do with the crime, we had to identify that before we could go forward, because there were just, it raised too many questions. And that was what kept you up at night, because even if we had other pieces of evidence that we could maybe get something from, you still had to come back to that why and really answer the question, why? Why is there a why, and whose is it?
I'll ask you about some of those other pieces of evidence that you did have in a second, but talking about a jury, such a big piece of this case, and we haven't talked about it outright yet, was that there were other people accused, convicted, and then appealed and overturned in this case.
Right.
So many, just a roller coaster for families, for juries who served in those cases, for prosecutors. Talk about, why that was so important, especially after what those 4 men went through, the community went through, and we'll note for our audience, just around the corner, some hearings to really try to continue to clear the names of those 4 men. But why was really getting some of this concrete evidence so key in light of what had happened previously in the case?
Right, and again, that's what my heart's broke for those families, because regardless, if you think, back then, if you thought that they did it or they didn't do it, the families to have to go through, first of all, years of not having a face, or a name to put with the case. And then when they're finally given one and 2 juries return these verdicts, and then the appellate courts over the years, thankfully, reversed or commuted the death penalty to a life sentence in one case. And in the other, he was already serving a life sentence. But all of these appellate rulings over the years just had to be brutal to these families to have to continuously go through this and talk about, they don't really use the word closure, because in this sense, they never really got closure. It was just anytime they felt they could rest. And even after Dan, once we told them recently about Brasher's, I don't know that they still felt they could rest on that, because so many times they've been told something only to have the carpet ripped out from underneath them. So that was very frustrating, seeing that over the years. But to answer your question, yeah, it was very hard, because we knew that there were these 2 juries that had returned these verdicts. We had statements from 2 of the men that were consistent with each other, and they talked about specific details that you shouldn't have known unless you were there. And so obviously that convinced 2 juries. But now we know, because of DNA, thankfully, that they weren't there. And that's a hard journey as a prosecutor to accept. I wasn't the original prosecutor on it, but I'm asked all the time, how did these prosecutors deal with it? I haven't talked to them, actually, but I've talked to one of them. But you can't look back. It's so easy for us now. Oh, sure, now we know Robert Brasher's was there, right? We've got his DNA, and we know what a monster he was and a madman. But yeah, they didn't know all that. They had these 2 confessions that, again, a judge ruled admissible, and the juries returned verdicts of guilty. So I don't blame the prosecutors for that at the time, and I certainly don't blame the jurors.
We know in just a few days we will see steps to clear their names, and we'll be covering that hearing. We know that there will be developments out of that. But I want to get back to some of the physical evidence that also helped get us towards who we now know actually committed this crime. There was so much talk at that press conference in the fall about the shell casing. And you all actually made a trip to Kentucky with the shell casing. Explain what was going on there. Why was this shell casing so key? You alluded to it at the beginning of our conversation.
So it was one of the very few, outside of microscopic pieces of DNA, it was really the only physical evidence we had in that case, because of the destruction of the fire, right? There's not much else we had to work on. And so that was, and at the time we didn't know if that was ever going to be a piece we could use. But in late June, I kind of started going down the chain of custody, the evidence trail of where that 380 was, because I wanted to think, well, what can we do with it? Is it possible to get DNA from it? There is a new method that you can extract DNA from a spent shell casing. But but there's caveats to it. And so I was like, well, maybe let's see if we could do that. When I realized it wasn't going to be possible, because back in '97, the spent shell casing had been submitted to an ATF database to be searched, called IBIS. And once it's submitted, they image it, they take photos of it, and they submit the photos, the imaging, into a database to see if it matches other photos from other spent shell casings, the little small tool marks. But once it's that, you can't extract DNA once you've done that, because those machines are not sterile. So you potentially get DNA from the last spent shell casing that was put in there. So once that was not an option, I was like, all right, well, what could we do with it? And it was in 97, and then later I found out it was also in 2007. But I reached out to we have a gun unit here that they're APD officers, and they're deputized with the ATF. And I said, hey, this happened back in 97, and then later 07. Some of these primitive or early database, some of this early software, is that data still in the current one, or should I resubmit it? And they said, well, it should be still there, but even if it is or isn't, resubmit it anyway, because technology's gotten so much better. The imaging software, we're now doing like 3D modeling, and so anything you haven't submitted in the last 10 years, do it again, because it's not going to hurt, right? It's not like DNA where every time you submit it, you consume a bit. I mean, we still have the shell casing, and so the morning of July 2nd, they took it out of evidence and put it into the NIBIN machine, and that afternoon, they got a hit and called me and said, hey, are you sitting down? And I knew when they called, there was something different. Because I figured if they didn't get anything, it would just be a text. Hey, sorry, nothing. We tried.
Because we've heard that.
We've heard that before. And so, I was actually in Port Aransas, the family vacation, and they said, you sitting down? I was like, yeah, I'm sitting at the beach. And they're like, you got a drink? And I was like, yeah, I've got a drink in my hand. What's going on? They're like, all right, you got to hear this. And so they said they had gotten a hit to, it was unsolved murder in Lexington, Kentucky. And but it was in 1998, 7 years later. And so I was like, well, is that related? Or is this just one gun that gets passed around to criminals? Because that's common. Mm-hmm. You've got just guns that are used in different crimes that are unrelated. And they said, well, it was a woman. She was found shot in the back of the head, and the building was set on fire. And so we were like, oh. And I immediately jumped on the phone with Mindy. I was like, Mindy, you're not going to believe this. So it became a working vacation for sure. Reached out to Lexington and was like, hey, and they had only submitted their shell casing in 2024. So it wouldn't have hit. Timing was perfect.
Timing in this case,
it was everything.
Every step of the way, it's been about good timing.
So we got on the phone with their detective, and then we decided, we need to do an in-person roundtable. So Mindy and I, and then two other detectives from our cold case unit, spent a week in Lexington with their people, just going over the case files, trying to find any connection. Was this the same person, or was it the most weird coincidence ever that the same gun was used in a similar crime? And I think at the end of that week we left with more questions than answers.
We did.
Because really nothing in the yogurt shop file has the word Kentucky in it. There's nothing related to Kentucky, and vice versa. They had no Texas connection. And so it was like, well, is this guy just a drifter? He doesn't have any connections to Texas or Kentucky. That's why it's never been solved. Stranger on stranger violence is the most difficult thing to solve. But that started sort of the 2-month roller coaster.
Talk about, like you said, about to be on a 2-month roller coaster, but you're on the plane back from Kentucky. And I'm sure the feeling on the way there and the feeling on the way back were very different. What do you talk about in those moments? What are you two saying on the plane? You're on the way back. Where do you go next?
I think it's like, what are we missing? Is there a connection we haven't figured out yet? And one of the things we did was we got their case file, they got our case file. And it's like, all right, y'all go through we'll continue to go through them. And maybe there's something, a license plate somebody wrote down that is their case file, and just something there. There's got to be a link. And one of the things I did was we merged all the contact lists for our case file. It's 20,000 names over the years of people related to this case. And we had theirs, it was several hundred, quite a big still case file. And then we got the crime analyst, Pam, from the AG's office to try to find anything in those that are in those two Excel sheets that are pages and pages long. There was nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah.
So Talk to us now. At some point, you do a national search that kind of keeps this chugging along. So when did you start to see, you called it a 2-month roller coaster. When did you start to ramp up on that roller coaster?
Well, one of the things we did with Lexington guys is, so their case hadn't been really worked. It was a cold case. The detective was assigned to it because we got this hit. So they had a lot of items that had not been tested in recent years that could be for DNA. And so we kind of worked with them as a testing strategy. Here's some things that would be beneficial, perhaps, that you could test. And so I began talking to their state lab, and I asked their state lab, hey, like, we don't have a CODIS eligible profile. We have a YSTR. Like, do y'all have a YSTR? Because then we could compare and be like, is this the same guy? And they said, no, we don't, but we can get one for you. We have plenty of DNA. We'll type one out for you. And I said, okay. So it's like, do y'all normally collect Y data? Because some labs in the country do, some don't. Not most of them don't, but they collect Y data on their offender database to do like familial testing. There are about, I don't know, a dozen labs in the country that do this. So they said, yeah, we just started that not too long ago. So we do collect that. So I said, all right, well, can you take our Y profile and manually search your database? Because it's not an automated, the way it works is it's not automated like CODIS is. You have to do it once, and that's like manually type it in, and then does it stay in the database. So if I did it today, and then tomorrow the offender gets put in, it would never connect. They said, yeah, we'll do that for you. Just send us your data. I said, okay, we'll get a formal request, interagency request. And that kind of gave the idea of, well, why don't I do that with everybody? Let's ask every lab in the country to do that. There's only about a dozen of them. So talking with Mindy and our forensic science division was like, yeah, let's do that. Our forensic science division reached out to the CODIS administrator with the state of Texas, Department of Public Safety, and said, can you push out to all the labs that collect Y profiles to manually search against our unknown? And everybody came back and said, nothing, nada, except one. The South Carolina State Forensics Lab called us and said, we got one for you. Every marker you have is the same. And so we were like, and they said, but we can't tell you who it is yet.
But we can tell you.
They're like, but it might be a serial killer.
That's what they said. It looks like it might be coming back to a known serial killer, but we can't give you the name. So
we spent 3 weeks searching every serial killer in South Carolina, which I don't think we even came across Brashers, did we?
No, that's what's so crazy. I mean, even on a Google search, this is why it's so important that we connect resources, because even on a Google search, serial killers, South Carolina, and we knew the years, his name didn't pop up. And they had press conferences about it. So it's crazy. Also timing, we mentioned that earlier. We had done a national request back in 2019, like Dan just did. But when Dan first came on board, he had said, why don't we do that? But we were told, you just did one in 2019. Chances are, you're going to get the same thing back. But after this, here we are, we've got this, new information about the shell casing, and Dan said, let's do it again. I mean, no time like the better in 2025. So that's another thing. South Carolina, had we done this, 2 years earlier, or we did do it in 2019, South Carolina just wasn't doing these searches yet. So in 2025, we were their first search and their first hit.
Yeah, they said they couldn't tell us because they had to get it cleared with legal, because they want to make sure they're doing it correctly, like quality assurance, make sure they didn't fat finger anything, and can they release this information, because no one had ever asked for it. Like, we were the first people to come to them and say, can you do a manual search of your Y profile? So back in 2019, like he was saying, like they weren't even collecting data back then. This was a brand new thing, or I don't know, the last couple of years that they just started doing it, but we were the first to ask for it.
Do you think departments and investigators will be doing this more now after you all blazed this trail?
I think so, because nobody really knows it's a thing.
Right.
And I asked our CODIS administrator, how often do you get these requests from other detectives in other states? He's like, never. You're it.
Why do you think that is?
Knowledge. I mean, again, if we can connect these resources, we're going to be doing a bunch of trainings and conferences where we speak about this case, and that's one of the things one of the reasons we're doing it is to tell these departments, if you have a shell casing that you entered in NIBIN years ago, you might want to redo it. You might want to try to do it again, because that's what happened to us. If you haven't considered doing a Y keyboard search, you should consider it. These are things that, you know, not all departments know about, and we want to make sure we get the word out about the possibilities.
Does that open up to, like you said, the labs throughout this process seemed really amenable to testing and working with you all, but crossing that line between the science of it and then the detective work seems kind of like it's still developing, even those relationships. You know, I think one of my next questions for you too is, I'm struck by a lot of what you all are saying is just folks on the phone. This got talked about a bit at the press conference. It's just picking up the phone and saying, can you do this? I know there was a key phone call with South Carolina too, so I want to talk about that. So just, talk about the conversations throughout this, especially as you all were starting to get really close to knowing, you know, the breakthrough in this case.
The conversations were great. I mean, we had cooperation and motivation from like city, state, federal agencies across state lines. Everybody was on board to help, and you know, if it linked to the detectives who had worked Brasher's before on their cases, and some of the just other agencies that, you know, we needed records from 34 years ago on a traffic stop or whatever, they were all willing to, you know, go back and dig in the archives and help us find stuff. Because most of that stuff's not digitized. It's all in basements somewhere from that long ago. But yeah, that night, or the day I got it was a Friday at like 6 p.m. Always Friday evening. And I got a letter from the lab saying, you know, from South Carolina State Lab saying that there was a CODIS hit on the not a CODIS hit, but a YSTR hit. And it didn't have a name. It just said, this is the case number, this is the date. It's Greenville, South Carolina, and a contact name of Tim Conroy. And had his phone number. So of course I Google that date, Greenville, South Carolina, and that's when Brasher's pops up. And I was like, oh, wow, you know. And so I sent it to Minnie, texted Minnie, like, you gotta start researching this guy. But I called Tim that evening, and that was actually his cell phone. I thought it was gonna be an office phone and leave a voicemail, but it was his cell phone. And he picked up, and I said, hey, I got this letter. And he goes, yeah, I just got it. And he goes, hey, he didn't know anything about the case. And he goes, but he goes, your girl? And I said, well, there's 4 girls. And he's like, 4 girls? And he didn't know. And I said, yeah, those 4 girls. And he goes, hey, were they tied up with their own clothing? And that's when I was like, you know, oh, you know, expletive. Like, oh shit, you know? And I said, yeah. And he goes, yeah, mine was too. And he told me a little bit about his case. And he goes, hey, I'm gonna go back to the office this evening. And I'm gonna get you my case file. And I'm gonna send it to you tonight. And so we were off at that point to like, and then that's when I realized, oh, there's also other murders this guy's been linked to 2 in Missouri. Sexual assaults, burglaries, like this guy was all over the place, you know, prolific. And that just sort of connected us to their network. All these guys already knew each other from years past. And then I think we talked to Missouri State Police, Chris and Alex, who've been great. We're friends now, we talk all the time, about work still, but we still communicate. And when I talked to Chris Hamlet with Missouri State Police, he goes, yeah, he goes, I've got hundreds and hundreds of pages to send you. I've kept it all. On this man, their murders, but also what else they had gathered in their investigation from other agencies. He goes, and we were already starting to get information, but he's like, I'll send what I have because that'll save you some time. He's like, I knew someday another detective would call me because I knew this wasn't all he was responsible for. And he goes, we had no idea he was in Texas. And so that started sort of this network of communicating with us in Lexington and South Carolina and Missouri and ATF and the Texas Rangers and the Border Patrol. And I mean, just, I think 15 different agencies that I have reports from.
Wow. And it was just a free-for-all when we first got the name. And we've always called them Brasher's, and now we know the family goes by Brashears. But we just can't stop saying Brasher's. It's not to be disrespectful, but I mean, we lived this for so long. Well, to the family, not to him.
No, right? And the family, I've talked to his daughter, and she's the sweetest woman, and she's just trying to help us find out what her dad did.
They've been filling in a lot of holes
for us. Some of the gaps that you Talking about him, what was that moment like? You said you Googled him and it came up. Seeing this person's name and face for the first time and thinking, I think we've got it. What was... That
was surreal. We were like, can't get too excited. It's yogurt shop.
Right. Anything could happen.
We're going to find out he was in prison or something. You know, like, we were like, we can't be... But I think the most surreal moment of that little couple of weeks was when we got the report from South Carolina and we had our unknown that we had studied for years of all the different markers. and a name next to it when every marker was the same.
It was putting them next to each other, so many years.
Hundreds of people didn't match.
And it would just be such a letdown. And some of them would match at a lot of markers. I mean, at one point we had an exact match with somebody. It was in the FBI database, and we had to get in a fight with the FBI to try to get that, and that's a whole other story. But, this was the only other time we had seen them line up, perfectly, and just
and the
chills.
Match, and the FBI was not Brasher's.
It was not.
It matched at 21 markers, and then because that's the only amount of markers that database was looking at the time. But we had 27, and the FBI had 27. So when we said, here's our other 6, they're like, no, it's not.
Actually, technology had gotten better. Too during the fight.
Yeah.
And then once they ran it with the new technology, we realized it wasn't a match. But that was just another one of those things where you think, oh my gosh, we've got it. I remember that call with the FBI, so excited. They're going to give us a name, and no.
So you have this name, this person, you are starting to see potentially the network of crimes he's connected to. But explain for folks, when did you actually know? What was the final piece of the puzzle that let you all know you had got the person responsible?
Yeah. So we went from, wow, Lexington, this might be the same guy, to got a name, okay, this could be the same guy. All right, I think it's the right guy, to I know it's the right guy. And that was a week before the press conference, we got DNA back from Amy's fingernails, that they had male DNA that we had known about for years. It just wasn't anything they could do with it because technology hadn't caught up to how degraded or a small amount it was. But now, we're there. And we were able to do a one-to-one comparison, and the lab called me. I was walking into the Astros game, and Mindy was like, "Hey, are you available for a call?" I was like, "Yeah, sure." And it was the lab. They were working Friday night,
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock Friday night. And they put Rachel on the phone with us, and she was like, "She's going through." I'm like, I can barely hear her because it's loud. And then she goes, "Yeah." She goes, and then she goes, "It's him." And I'm sorry, what? She goes,
there.
It's there. His DNA is there. And so it was just
underneath Amy's fingernails. And all along, we have thought that was a possibility that Amy fought. Now, with everything I've read and reviewed, I don't want to answer for Dan, but it really seems like the evidence supports that theory because she was found in a different part of the shop than the other girls. She was shot twice. The others were shot once. And then she had the fingernails. She had his DNA underneath her fingernails. So
not only did she solve this case for us, she solved Lexington, Kentucky's case. Because had she not fought back or tried to run, the second gun wouldn't have come out. And so all we would have is a 22, because he shot them all with a 22. Had he not needed to use a second gun because she was fighting, we would never have that shell casing. So Linda Rutledge's murder would never be solved. Maybe it's solved someday with DNA, but the connection would never be made. And
we would have solved this quickly.
Right.
Quickly, and we would have never realized it was connected to Lexington. It was just, she did it all for us.
You all were both very emotional, obviously, in the press conference revealing that fact. I know the family emotional too, and I think your everyday person in Austin hearing that this young girl solved this case. Clearly not immune to it. But just talk about what that's been like, getting to tell her family that, and the other girls' families. Just getting some sort of, like you said, there's not a lot of closure, but what a gift to be able to say that, your daughter had a hand in solving this, and like you said, potentially other cases across the country.
So Mindy brought it up. She's like, when we went to tell the Ayers family, I told Sonora Thomas on the phone already on the way to the Ayers, because she was in Boston, so I had to call her and say, I'll be on a flight tomorrow, or you want me to do this over the phone? She's like, just tell me. So I told her, but when we sat down at the Ayers, we talked about, I think this could be our guy, or I'm pretty sure this is our guy. Oh, I know this is our guy, that progression. But we had never said, when we sat down with them and said, I know who killed your girls. And that had never been said before. And so, of course, everybody, we lose it. And they're all just staring at us like, what do you mean? What? What do you mean? They didn't expect that out of our mouth, or my mouth.
They thought it was going to be another lead, but a really big one. They didn't know he was going to say, I know who killed Amy.
they knew it was something different because the night before I said, "Where are y'all? I need to talk to you in person." And she was like, and Sean and Angie were like, "We knew something was up because your voice sounded different." And so the next morning they were showing horses in Bryan. So we got in the car and drove to Bryan, Texas that morning and met them. And I said 10 a.m. because Angie was cutting at 9. And so we rolled up at 10 and they were standing outside waiting for us.
Waited a long time for that.
What was that conversation like?
Surreal.
Yeah.
Because at first they're just like, what? And I think, and then Angie looked at me, she goes, 100%, and I said 100%. And then I think Bob goes, "He dead?" And I said, "Yeah, he's dead." And then they wanted to see a picture, and so I showed them the picture. And then we just started laying out the case, like how we got from the spent shell casing to the like just everything in that 2-month period, and who he was, and how we, what we know about him, and but we still have a lot to learn about him. And ask me all these questions again because this is probably not sinking in.
And they did.
And they did, yeah. And so did Barbara and Barbara Wilson and Sonora. I've talked to a couple times. Like, they're like, "I know you probably told me this, but what? Tell me again how this happened," because you're in shock. I mean, it's human nature. You're not going to like absorb everything of that magnitude.
I think one of the notable things when we were telling the families, we were sad to have to tell them that he was dead because I knew that was going to be the next question. Is he alive? We want justice. And we had to tell him he shot himself, in a police standoff back in 1999. But when we were telling Barbara, who had lost both her girls, she said, at first she was kind of taken aback that he was dead, but then she said, "I think that's better. I couldn't have sat there another trial." And I thought, wow. It took me back to those heartbreaking moments for those families to have to sit there through that whole legal process. And in the end, she was actually pleased that he wasn't alive and they wouldn't have to go through all that again.
Some semblance of a relief,
Right.
almost.
Right.
Throughout our conversation, you all have talked about how so much of the steps forward in this case hinged on a maybe or a what if or a maybe someday the technology will catch up or the database will have something in it. What hope does that give you as investigators of more cases to come that could be solved, whether linked to Brashears or other cold cases?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, there's other cold cases where we have limited amounts of DNA and the quantities maybe not enough, but we need half as much now as we did 2 years ago. So what's going to happen in 2 more years? We'll be able to retest the case we can't test today. So those labs across the country, it's amazing how rapidly all this is evolving from quantity and quality is getting better every day.
I mean, we had just done a whole round of testing where we sat in a room with the lab and APD and we went through line by line on an Excel sheet. What could we test? What should we test? What haven't we tested? This is back in 2019, I think. And, we got results back and we had made some progress, but still not enough for that, smoking gun, so to speak. And so it does show you that with technology, it's changing weekly. I mean, they'll tell us just like the NIBIN, if you haven't put it in, technology has changed, or if you put it in a long time ago, try it again. And even if you've tested things, if you've done DNA testing in the last 3 years, you should probably try it again. That's how fast DNA is changing.
It makes you wonder, so many stories that have to do with serial killers, it's like, oh, if this connection had just been made.
Right.
Do you think we'll start to see less and less of these cases that linger for so long that might be connected in the way that this one is? Or do you think it'll still be an issue that investigators will always have to overcome?
I think we prevent a lot of serial killers from reoffending by catching them after their first one because of technology. Cell phone data, license plate readers, like surveillance cameras are everywhere. I think it's just harder to get away from, and of course we have touch DNA and like fingerprints at high resolution scanners that, you couldn't get an AFIS hit 20 years ago. Now you can resubmit that fingerprint. And I think it's just harder to get away with it now.
Genealogy. That's exploded.
And somebody like Brashears who would cross state line, he would be living here, he would go 2 hours across state line, he hunted not in his hometown. He knew that was because police weren't talking back then. We weren't sharing resources, and that's changed. Where we're sharing data, we're looking for patterns. It's because of the internet. It's easy to communicate with somebody 5 hours away, and so I think it's harder to be a serial killer. I had a murder case where I have no doubt that he would have. Well, when we caught him, he was going to kill more people. He was stopped with a murder weapon getting into his car, and he was just killing random people, or shooting random people. One of them died, one of them just got shot a bunch of times. And when we arrested him, he was getting back in his car with the gun. So I have no doubt he was going out to kill, but we caught him because of technology.
When it comes to Brashears, I know you said you're still working to figure out other cases he might be involved in, how wide this web goes. Is there a motive? I know the technology and the physical evidence, but is there a motive you're looking for? I know, Mindy, you've talked about just the depravity of this person, but is there any takeaway of why? Is there a why?
He could get away with it. He kept getting away with it. He kept getting bonds. I mean, he would be in custody on a very serious offense, a very scary offense, and get a bond. He received parole much earlier than he should have in the Florida case. That was back in 81, 83.
85 to 89.
And he was supposed to serve a 12-year sentence. If he hadn't gotten out,
he wouldn't have killed Jenny Zatriki, and he wouldn't have killed Amy, Eliza, Jennifer, and Sarah.
For folks at home who may not have followed the case out of Kentucky or the South Carolina case, are there any other patterns that we might start to see as more of these cases come to light from this person in particular?
Yeah, I mean, he has a similar MO, but he changes it up quite a bit as well. So the South Carolina one's the outlier that we know of. His victims, he typically attacks young girls, typically shoots them execution style, often ties them up, and there's always a sexual assault. Most of his crimes have a sexual assault component to it, except for like a few thefts and burglaries. So there's probably more out there. The South Carolina one's a little different because that was a strangulation, and he was actually living in the same town. And that's what led to his discovery, is through genealogy, and they figured out, wait, this guy was living in the same town as the victim. Oh, this might be a clue. The rest of them he would hunt. He would specifically go to several hours away, often cross state lines, and to make it harder to find them. But I think we know of 2 fire cases now, right? We know of Kentucky and us, but there's also other things where he may have changed things up that we just don't know about yet.
Is it a given that we could expect more cases to come out to be tied to him?
100%. I mean, that's my feeling.
Yeah, because we knew, I think it came up in the press conference, 2 months ago we knew he was good for 3, today we know he's good for 8. So what else is out there? We've looked into other cases already, different agencies. We've eliminated him from 3 murders, but there's a couple that look potentially, we may eliminate him from those as well, but there's a couple other cases that we're currently looking at.
I want to end by circling back to the 4 girls in this case. I would love if you all could remind folks a little bit about what we knew about them, what we know about who they were. I know you spent so much time with their families over the course of this investigation, and I would just love to end talking about them a bit, and what the family's hope is next now as you all continue this work so closely with them.
I think one of the things that Angie Ayers said that really struck me is that she feels, she calls her twin, would have been her sister-in-law, Amy, and that she feels that she's now able to work with her twin, with her sister, through her sister really, to try to solve these cases, and maybe with this nonprofit, if we're able to help other agencies take those cold cases off the shelf with funding, then we're doing Amy right. We're doing right by Amy. I know Dan and I have separately, because we'll talk about it later after the fact, but we've separately gone to the yogurt shop at different times throughout this investigation and just looked at the mementos and they have a little stone there with their photos or their names, and almost just for inspiration. It's crazy, but I go to this gas station. It's not even on my way, But I purposely go there because I think it's right across from the yogurt shop. And so sometimes when I would be feeling really low, I would just sort of go over there and think, maybe they'll give us some inspiration, or, you know, tell us we're not crazy to keep going and to keep fighting. And then I remember after we knew about Brasher's, going back and just feeling this, I get emotional thinking about it, but just feeling this sense of the full circle that, you know, we had done right by them. And you asked about them. I mean, you know, if you look at videos and pictures, they could have been your friends. I mean, they were loving and gregarious and cared about animals. I mean, they loved animals, and they loved their family and their friends. And I think, you know, the Ayers would say Amy was a fighter. I mean, Bob Ayers, first time I met him, he told me, she fought. I promise you she fought. And she did.
And yeah, I think because their memories or their lives are frozen in time.
Right.
Like, you look at them as that could be your sister or your best friend, or you know, who knows? I was an FFA just like they were. There's a chance we would have run into each other at a show, you know, in the coming years. But you look at them like these are just the same girls because that you would hang out with at school, that you would call your friend. And now they would be mothers or grandmothers, but the families are frozen in time too. And so all we have is those videos that shows that they're just loving regular kids.
You mentioned, you know, Amy being such a fighter, and I think nobody can listen to anything about this case and the work you all did and know that, or not think that the investigators on this case were such fighters, the families, just the persistence and faith that everybody who touched this case brought. Is there anything else you want to let people know? I know there's still so much work to be done, but, you know, anything else you want people to take away when they hear this story? Something we try to do on our show is really cut through a lot of the, you know, just the darkness in these cases. And what I consistently hear from people on the other side of the chair here is just so much faith and persistence. But is there anything that you all want to share with the audience about why you do this?
To the families who have cold cases that haven't been solved, I would say just keep on your detective. Like, you know, that persistence on their end to make sure that the case doesn't get, because we have so many cases, and it's you know, it's a numbers game of what we can and can't do, but to make sure that their case isn't collecting dust, and just always be out there. Like, some people don't want to be bothered at all, but if they want to just reflect, but if you feel you need to you know, reach out to your detective who has assigned your case, do it, because let them know that this still needs to be worked.
I just think never giving up hope. I mean, that's why we do what we do. You have to have a little bit of divine intervention. I mean, in every case we've solved, and at least I can talk about it from my perspective, it seems like there's been a little bit of divine intervention, or luck, however you want to call it. Timing has been a big factor. Persistence, you know, having detectives willing to think outside the box. And I mean, thank God Dan is still talking to me, because the number of times I would say, can you just make sure Kenneth McDuff is there? we run him against Kenneth McDuff, or, you know, I'd come up with some crazy theory, and Dan he didn't laugh at my face, but I think he probably laughed, you know, behind my back. But you know, I think that's the thing. We weren't afraid to try new things, and there was no stupid question. There really wasn't. You know, what about this? Or why didn't we do this? Or should we do this? I think as long as everybody working on the case, and by the way, collaboration, you know, this isn't, I mean, Dan gets, good Lord, we're so happy that Dan Jackson finally got this case. But, you know, it really has been, like he alluded to earlier, the hard work over time of every person who's picked up this case, and they've put their heart and soul into it. And just because, you know, we didn't hit that one, that one lead didn't turn out to be anything, it's still the persistence of these investigators and prosecutors, the collaboration with other agencies being willing to help you.
Yeah, I mean, over the 30 years, all these detectives that worked on it put their heart and soul into it. It did a great job, and each one of them moved the ball a little bit forward towards the goal line, even if it was eliminating somebody, right? Or getting some testing done, knowing, okay, we can use this in the future, but we can't do it now. Like every detective that worked on it over the last 30 years got closer to the finish line, and then I just got lucky at the end and took it across.
I think I can say it sounds like it was a bit more than
Yes,
just luck,
it was.
but a lot of hard work by the two of you. I could keep you here forever asking questions. I think our audience probably has a few there yelling through the screen. Avery, you missed this, ask them about this. So we hope to stay in touch with the two of you, particularly as this investigation continues to develop. But thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you for doing
Thanks
this
for having us.
series. This is a great series, Avery.
And thank you for your work on this case. I think the whole city of Austin, if they got to sit here across from you guys in this chair, would say thank you very much. Join us next week on KXAN Plus for another episode of Unsolved Central Texas. New episodes air every Thursday at 1. And watch any episode anytime. Just go to KXAN.com or look for the KXAN Plus Originals category on our streaming app. We'll see you next week.